Right, I'm going to make a start, if that's okay with everyone. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a step change for charity governance. Thank you for joining us today and this webinar with DigiBoard, all about charity governance. So I'm Jenny Berry. I think some of you know me. I'm the Crisis and Governance Lead for ACEVO, and I will introduce the panelists in a minute, but I've just got a bit of housekeeping, if that's all right, first of all. So we are recording this session, so it'll be available for you to view again later on, and it's also available for other members. So we are recording it, but obviously not the chat box. I will keep an eye on both the chat box and the Q&A box, so please place your questions there. If you're using the chat box, please change it to panelists and attendees so that everybody can engage with it and see what's coming up and see if their question has already been asked or not asked, etc. So do use that. I will, if it's okay with the panelists, I will only intervene if there's a question of clarity from one of the delegates. If they want clarity about a point you're raising, I might just gently intervene and say, can you explain that a bit further or make it clearer? Otherwise, I'm going to hold the questions. We've got about 15, 20 minutes, we reckon, towards the end for a Q&A session. So do think of things during the session. So we're going to move on to introducing the panelists in a minute, but just to say that I'm really glad we're doing this. Charity governance, I think, is often seen as not a priority for charity CEOs. It's not seen as a priority for their charitable trustees. And we know why. It's all about the fundraising, it's about the issues of the beneficiaries. But actually, if we don't get it right, if we don't get the charity governance right, if we haven't got the processes right, if we haven't got the right people around the table, then are we doing the right service? Are we doing it well enough? So we know that we need to get this right. We need to strengthen the charity objectives. We're going to hear from DigiBoard about how they can do this really helpfully with for our members. And we're going to hear from one of our members who's used this, who is as much of a charity geek as me. So we're going to hear from how we can work this together. So can I pass over to Helen Michaels, who's the CEO and one of the founders of DigiBoard, who will also introduce her colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And before we begin, I'd just like to thank the ACEVO team for arranging today's webinar. And by the way, when you hear what I have to say, Jenny and I did not collude in this, but it's very much to point. My name is Helen Michaels, as Jenny said. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DigiBoard. We work exclusively with charities and not-for-profit organisations in their great quest to improve their governance. And for my sins, I'm also the vice chair and trustee of the Campaign for Better Charity, a Campaign for Better Transport charity. So I see governance from two sides. On our panel today, we're joined by Terry Stevenson, the CEO of Age UK Lancashire, and David Burland of DB Associates. David is a specialist charity sector consultant and strategic advisor that we work with very closely. He has first-hand experience of a range of both traditional and digital approaches to governance reviews. He's also sat on both sides of the governance fence, like myself, as a CEO and as a board trustee. And his experience, in my humble opinion, gives him an outstanding and in-depth understanding of charity governance. And David, you can pay me later. Terry is a partner, a peer CEO and an ACEVO member. She will tell us about Age UK Lancashire's journey to better governance after the charity took the very brave step to try a different digital approach for their governance review. Can you just excuse me? I just need to blow my nose. Very embarrassing.
It's that time of the year, Helen.
Sorry?
Excuse me, I said it's that time of the year, I'm afraid.
It is that time of year.
I'll buy you some handkerchiefs after that introduction, Helen.
Thank you. But before we look at the alternative approaches, as Jenny said, let's begin with some context about governance in our sector. The generally held view is when the resources, time and money are scarce, improving charity governance is often put on the back burner, which is very frustrating for everybody. Yet we found that many charities during the pandemic it's actually highlighted the need for governance to be put back into stark focus, particularly when you start looking at reserves and whether the charity is actually going to survive. We've also found that charity leaders often see governance as complex, maybe an administrative burden. So quite often that's actually a put off, so they won't even think about a review. And let's face it, other than us governance geeks, We do know that many others find governance just plain boring. Sorry, Jenny. But we need to be realistic about how people do see governance. However, what if there's an easier way to assess how effective governance is? For example, if we can assess the effectiveness with respect to the principles of the Charity Governance Code, but not just the Charity Governance Code, there are a lot of other factors that contribute to good governance. What if the approach could evaluate the oversight role of the board, as well as what we see from the executive team and what the exec team needs to do to meet our charity governance commitments? And what if, instead of being complex and time consuming, we could use technology to simplify the whole process and do so in a cost and time efficient way? And we could measure our progress over time from one review to the next. This challenge was what drove us and became our mission at DigiBoard, to find a digital solution for charity governance reviews that are no longer a chore, one that's carried out every 3 to 5 years, if at all. So we're going to look at how the two approaches, the traditional way and the digital alternatives, as well as how we can actually, how this should include an assessment of how the board and the executive team work together as the route to good governance. But before we start, can I just ask Nabila, if you can actually launch the first poll, please? Okay, an interesting set of results. I think we've got nearly 3/4 of the participants are actually saying, yes, it should be mandatory. Maybe we should feed that back to the Charity Commission, Jenny.
I think they would say, well, people that came to this session are into governance anyway. So I think, yeah, we should ask it in another session that's all about the arts or something.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, so share the results. Can everyone see the results?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go into my presentation now. Please forgive me while I get this up. Can everybody see, whoops, can everybody see that first slide, colourful slide?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with a definition. When we talk about a governance review, we mean a board effectiveness review or a board evaluation. We see these terms as actually being interchangeable. The content might be slightly different. There might be different factors that are actually covered, but they are basically the same thing. And I hope and trust that people actually do agree with me on this. But let's go back to the Charity Governance Code and have a look at the board effectiveness principle. And what it says is that the board actually reviews its own performance annually and has an external evaluation every 3 years. How many of us actually do that? And each evaluation should consider how the board works together and other factors that are relevant to effectiveness. Interestingly, the Charity Governance Code has got 7 principles and doesn't necessarily cover all of those factors. DigiBoard does cover those, and I'll explain what those are. The other part is that how does the charity review or evaluate it? And that should go into the governance statement in the trustees' annual report. And I will say that that particularly applies to larger charities. However, having said that, there is nothing to stop smaller charities demonstrating best practice. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen the Chartered Governance Institute white paper on the virtuous circle of good charity governance. If you haven't, I'd recommend that you actually try and get hold of a copy. It is a very good read. One of the issues that it actually does demonstrate is that there are hard and soft drivers which actually contribute to the balancing act of good governance. What are the hard drivers? They're the normal stuff that most of us are better at. The legal and regulatory, the annual reports, the formal reports that we have to submit to the Charity Commission, strategy and business plans, audit and risk and controls, policies and procedures. They're the bits that are much easier to tick off. But what about the soft drivers, which are just as important? As we know, we saw behaviours and culture were the underlying issues that caused some problems at places like Oxfam. What about our values and ethics, the way we live and breathe our charity, which is critical to our mission? and the board mix and skills, and particularly around equality, diversity and inclusion at the moment. And that classic, the board and executive team relationships. I think many of you may have attended the excellent session about the dynamic duo, where it emphasises the importance of that relationship with the CEO and the chair in terms of effective governance. And last but by no means least, one of the other critical soft drivers is how to engage with our stakeholders, but not just with our beneficiaries, but go beyond that. So many of us know about the Charity Governance Code, and this top bit are the principles of the Charity Governance Code. The factors below are the ones that we consider are the ones that actually need to be in a governance review. So a governance review should assess the code principles, but all the other critical factors. But as well as that, we think it's important that there's the alignment of the board and the executive team. How does that work in terms of contributing to good governance? What a governance review should also do is identify strengths and the areas for improvement, and what do we need to prioritise. But these are the factors. A DigiBuild review covers all of this, with optional topics for safeguarding income generation and governance of committees, depending on the size of the charity. Okay, so a traditional governance review, it quite often needs expertise, and these are not mutually exclusive. So it needs expertise, whether that's internal with a governance specialist or external with the help of a consultant. It also depends on how the governance specialist actually interprets the governance code that you're actually using. And some charities we do know use, for example, the corporate governance code because of their size, or they use both. A lot of traditional approaches rely on interviews as part of the review, which allows exploration of the responses, but quite often that can actually focus only either on the board or a select few. And there's the possibility, which we've been told about interviewer bias, which is a human reaction in many respects. Quite often you have to complete a whole load of surveys and forms, but what also happens is quite often is you might get one view. It might be the governance specialist that's collating the data, and also that means that person may be the one person doing the interpretation. There is a free charity governance code template, and I don't know how many of you have tried to fill that in, but I think it's about 20 pages long, if my recollection is correct, and it's a turgid read and a turgid task. But there are organisations and consultants who use survey tools such as SurveyMonkey, but what we have found is that the analytics for that are quite limited. All of this means that sometimes, particularly if you go externally, it can be expensive, resource and time intensive, whether that's internal or external. And you may need internal or external support, which all takes time. The alternative, and this is primarily a digital approach. What if the approach could actually be educational, so you learn about governance at the same time? What if you had consistent best practice measures? You could involve and get a collective view of the board and the senior leadership team, and you can assess the hard and soft drivers. It's quick, easy and convenient if you do it online, and it can be done in your own time. It's time, resource and cost efficient. And you get a whole set of results, both quantitative and qualitative, that you can access later on if you want to go into further detail. Plus, you can benchmark with other charities, and it can either be a standalone exercise or with external support. Oh, this is not moving. Okay. What we have here is and we're actually quite flattered about this. I don't know how many of you have seen the Directory of Social Change came up with a very simple, but we hope effective, particularly for small charities, free resource to evaluate governance. And what we've actually done here is we've compared it with DigiBoard, because it does actually provide some ratings, but it only assesses the Charity Governance Code principles. If you haven't had a look at it, we have, and encourage you, particularly for small charities, it can actually give you some useful data about your governance. What it doesn't do, unfortunately, is look at the soft drivers, and it doesn't look at safeguarding, funding and committees. As far as we're aware, there are no best practice indicators, and what we've done at DigiBoard is translated the Charity Governance Code into best practice indicators. And as we said, you can learn about governance as you're going along. There are some quantitative results for the light version that DSC do, but it's by principle only. and they don't have any qualitative results, which we do by principle and by question. Does it involve I'm not sure whether it actually involves both the trustees and the executive team. I believe that it does, but it doesn't necessarily separate out the results to check out the differences. Does it set actionable insights and priorities? We do. Can you benchmark with other charities? We most certainly can. And can you assess continuous improvement from review period 1 to 2? Is it time and resource efficient? Both of them are. The DSC version is free. Digiboard is not, but I guess the reason is because it's taken us several months and several years to develop our product. Okay, the other thing that's very important that we have actually found and keeps getting reinforced time and time again is that and all our data tells us that this is true, is good governance comes together where the senior leadership team, the executive and the board actually work together. That relationship for us is absolutely crucial to good governance. So a Digiboard review, I'm just going to move my panel over so I can see what I've written. A Digiboard review assesses the governance principles and the hard and soft drivers. We check about the alignment between the trustees and the executive. We can, if you want to, check out with other key stakeholders, for example, for a membership organisation. And how do we do this? We provide database priorities so that you can plan your governance improvements. And as we've said, we enable benchmarking across the wider sector. We are gradually getting to be able to provide benchmarking data for sub-segments of the charity sector. Okay, an example of the questions, they are designed to be learn as you go. So for example, we had chosen one from the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion section, which was updated, by the way, along with integrity after the refresh of the Charity Governance Code earlier this year, last year. And the questions are all phrased from a point of view, how well do we do something? And in this case, the first question on equality, diversity and inclusion is, how well do we actually, how good is our approach and does it reflect the work that we do with our communities? You can then assess a rating, a 5-point rating, from not at all well to very well. Then you can actually, there is an option for I can't judge, and that's particularly useful for new trustees or new executive team members who may not be able to answer some of the discrete governance questions. The clever bit is on the right-hand side, and these are the issues and the best practice indicators that we've developed and tested over time with over 50 charities now. And they are phrased as we could do better at. So this gives you an actionable insight immediately to be able to actually improve your governance. And in this particular example, it's about assessing the importance and the impact of ED&I and how this supports our aims and purposes. I'm not going to go through the rest of those, but that's just an example of how the questions actually work. Now let's have a look at the results. This is just one of a plethora of data that is available to you and to the consultant who you may be working with, or if you're working independently. And across the top, I don't know whether you can see that, but these are each of the principles going from the Charity Governance Code principles of organisational purpose all the way through to the foundation principle. We've also split things like decision-making, risk and control, because we think there's a lot of stuff underlying for that, and it separates out the hard and the soft drivers. And likewise, we split out board effectiveness from board composition. But we also have board behaviours and culture, safeguarding, etc., the other factors that we consider important to governance. So, but this is my favourite chart, because what you can clearly see here is the difference between the assessment of the trustees and that of the senior leadership team by each of the principles. And where you've got a disconnect, as you have here with leadership, that one using the actionable insights, you can then start to actually have a decent conversation about what are the things that we need to do, what do we need to do differently, and also what this helps to do because of the colour coding, which is traffic light coding, by the way, from dark green, which is good, to red, which is pretty poor. But you can start immediately seeing and pinpointing where you need to pay attention. The most frequently flagged issues, these best practice indicators. So what you can actually see, out of 9 participants, 8 of them actually said that we need time to explore different points of view, and 7 said that we needed to actually do appraisals. There does seem to be a reluctance of charity boards and corporate boards, I will say, to actually engage in appraisals. And actually, it's quite critical to the performance of how we go. If the exec team can be appraised, why shouldn't the trustees? And how do we pull this all together? Oh, there's some examples of the qualitative data. These are real life examples. This fact that some of these led to a debate about a couple of clients actually looking at their purposes, reviewing them and going right back to reassessing their governance documents. So they can actually add a richness to the entire data. The benchmarking data, again, you've actually got the governance principles down the left-hand side, the benchmark and your own charities ratings, and we provide a graph. So anything above the purple bars is the charity is the purple bars and the benchmark is the top one. So we do offer the option of a customized report, and this is with a dashboard. You get a dashboard page for each principle as well as an executive summary. And this is the equality, diversity and inclusion one. On the left-hand side, you see the graph and the count of how people have rated it. Down the bottom here, you get the commentary on the results and some individual recommendations. You have, again, a heat map for between the trustees and the executive team, and you get the issues flagged. So some quotes from some of our clients. It helped us to understand how the bits of governance all fit together and what we can do to make a real difference. And a chair of a housing and shelter charity said, it's more than just a question. It made me think about how we have to get the governance mindset right. Thank you, everybody. I hope that that was useful and that will stimulate some questions for our final session at the end. I'll now hand over to David, who'll take us through. So I need to stop sharing. I'll now hand over to David so that he can actually tell you about his experience of using Digiboard and the traditional approaches. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just going to get my presentation ready to go. So just to say, thank you, Helen, for your very kind words at the start as well. I've worked in and around the voluntary sector since 1989, which feels a long, long time ago. For the last 4 years or so, I've been running my own consultancy business. I've been working increasingly closely with Helen and her business partner, Frank, for the last couple of years. And as I hope I'll explain, I really enjoy working with Digiboard, find it a really good tool to work with. I've produced reports for getting on for 10 different charities so far. I'm also the chairman of a small foundation called the Emperor Foundation, which are linked to a marketing and corporate design consultancy. So, you know, I try and keep my hand in on the governance side as well. So when I was preparing for today, and this just builds on some of the things that have been said already, really, I just reflected on the fact that, for example, most charities have regular reviews of things like their investment policies and managers and their auditors. But I do think we have less of a culture of reviewing in the kind of way that Helen's talked about and Jenny introduced, how we govern and manage our organisations, although that is much more integral to our day-to-day operations than perhaps, you know, who our auditors are. And as we know, it is recommended that independent reviews happen 3 years, and indeed that annually charities are reviewing themselves. But I do think in practice that happens. Relatively few charities actually undertake that kind of approach. So I also asked myself, why is this? And I've come up with a number of reasons, which I've outlined there, which I think perhaps reflect part of the reason for this. And it never seems to be quite the right time to do a governance review. There's always other priorities. And frankly, sometimes trustees don't think they need it. I'm also going to be totally honest with you, as someone who's used the kind of traditional approach that Helen talked about, as well as a Digiboard approach. I think governance reviews are really important. But if I'm utterly frank, from my point of view as a consultant, doing it the traditional way is not the most exciting project in the world. The projects tend to be quite repetitive. You tend to have the same kind of discussions. And even, you know, you can use tools like Monkey Survey, as Helen said, but I think they're not bespoke in the same way Digiboard is, and don't give you the same level of analysis, and you always have to follow up with specific questions. So I will be honest and say that I don't find the traditional way of doing governance reviews particularly exciting as a project, although I see the importance of doing them. So this is part of the reason that I really enjoy working with Digiboard. And the traditional approach is also very time consuming from a consultant's point of view, and therefore from a client's point of view in terms of cost. So what I love about the alternative, about using Digiboard, just trying to get my page to turn over, which it doesn't want to do. So hold on a moment. There we go. We've only just shown you, because we've got a brief time today, really the tip of the iceberg. I'm one of these people that loves to see figures, to see charts, to delve into the analysis. And Digiboard gives you a whole wealth of information. Helen's just shown you, some of the data there. We could, anyone who's interested, I'm sure, be happy to do a one-to-one presentation another time. But there is a huge wealth of data, and because it's all done online through clever technology that I don't really understand, literally as soon as the last questionnaire has been completed and Helen's been told that, we then get most amazing reports and the kind of data that you saw today, which enables us to produce bespoke report and recommendations for individual clients, which reflect their own results and the data that's come from them, but also based on the knowledge that we have as people who've worked as governance consultants for many years. And there's still other elements that you can obviously include if you want to have someone to look at your governance documents and observe meetings, etc., etc. So Digiboard can be an answer in itself. It can also be part of a wider governance review if you so wish. What I thought might be helpful would be to give you a couple of examples of charities I've worked with. I haven't named them. So the first one was actually for a fairly small charity. It was the first review I did for Digiboard. I'd been through Helen's training and she taught me through it. I looked at the results and actually I thought, crikey, these aren't great results here. We've got a session coming up with the chairman and the chief exec in a week's time. I think I'll give the chief exec a bit of a heads up. And I phoned the chief exec up and actually said to him, look, you just need to be aware that there's quite a lot in here that shows you need to improve. And the first thing he said was, well, thank goodness for that, which wasn't perhaps what I was expecting. But what he said to me was basically, he felt that the trustees hadn't really understood their role. They hadn't understood the challenges for the charity. They hadn't understood their duties and responsibilities. And he said, well, if you're telling me that the results show that, that is really good news, because the results are based on what they said themselves. So they can't argue with it. So I gave you that example because obviously we would all like to have really good governance reviews. But on the other hand, if there is an issue there, I think Digiboard is a really good way for that to come out, because it's anonymized, because you're not speaking to an individual, because it gives you the whole wealth of data and all the aspects of the charity code and others, as Helen said, to look at. So that was really interesting. And actually, when we did the presentation with the chairman was relatively new, so that probably helped. But actually, they developed an action plan out of that to take forward a number of ways of developing their governance practice. The other charity is a hospice that I did a review with a few months ago. They've got a chair who's been in post for a couple of years, and they've really been going through a long-term process of updating a lot of what they do around governance. What they wanted to do was to use Digiboard as a way to ascertain how far they've got down that road, where they needed to go going forward, and to compare themselves to the wider sector. So we did a review. I went to do a presentation on the bespoke report we produced, and they're very positive about the feedback, because it really did show them where they had lots of positive areas. There were lots of areas where they had progressed. There were others that they needed to do more on. And I think Helen would probably agree with me. What we often find is that digital and EDI are two of the principles that people struggle in. I think they expect that. Sometimes it helps them to understand the context if they see that their results are poor, but most people's results are poor in that area. It doesn't lessen the importance of the issue, but shows that it is something that lots of people are looking at. So that particular charity found it really helpful to measure where they are in their progress, but also how to go forward. And I'm going to be cheeky and mention another quick example. This is, again, it was the hospice. They had a really good set of results. One of the areas, as you can imagine, that healthcare charities are particularly interested in is their score on safeguarding. And they got a really good score on safeguarding. But what we noticed was that 3 of their trustees said they couldn't judge. So actually, that in itself was a really important finding, because they realized that although they had lots of trustee members who did understand the issues and challenges, they had a small minority who didn't. And that wasn't, of course, best practice, best situation. So they put on a special training program for those trustees and made sure that they'll repeat that at regular intervals. I mean, that's a very small example of how they've used the tool, but to me, I think that's really important because it's the level of detail and points that come out of using the technology and insight that you can get from Digiboard. So that's just my perspective. As I said, I'm someone who works with Digiboard and use the tool, and I am a convert to the digital way of doing things. And if someone phones me up and wants me to do traditional approach, probably wouldn't want to do it anymore because I find this so much more rewarding and interesting. So thank you very much. I think we're passing on to Terry to talk about her experience as someone who's actually used the tool, you know, from the charity point of view. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me just start my slides. I'm going to assume that that's sharing the right thing. I'm sure somebody will shout at me if it's not. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk through the journey that Age UK Lancashire have been on with Digiboard over the last few years. And our journey started through an ACEVO competition. So those of you who've been ACEVO members for a few years might remember that there was a competition for a free Digiboard review. And we were the winners. So sorry if you're here and you also applied, because we beat you and we won it, and very delighted we were about that too. So one of the part of the process for the decision making about that competition, we were asked some questions. And these were really good questions, actually, and got some good conversation going in our organisation. So, how do you evidence your commitment to good governance in your annual report? We thought we did okay at that. Actually, it was quite well commented on. What are the potential consequences to your charity arising from the failure of governance? And actually, this was a really important question for us. I came into the charity in May 2018, and prior to that, the charity had been through a turnaround, and I think directly linked to governance. The trustees, I don't think, had been challenging the exec enough, and there were some elements of governance that could have avoided the turnaround that was needed. So we knew that governance hadn't been where it needed to be, and actually this was a really great tool for us to be able to start to understand, because we knew what some of the consequences were because we'd faced them, and didn't want to face those kind of consequences again. And the question, what was our charity's biggest governance challenge, kind of all led to the history that had gone before it. So linked to the turnaround, we'd got some trustees who were really risk averse, didn't want to do anything, some who wanted to nail down everything because there was a recognition that that hadn't happened before. So we had a real mix. So actually, I guess we won this competition because we'd got some pretty juicy answers. We kind of understood what it meant to have poor, and I never actually did ask Helen really why we won, but I think my guess is that it's because we knew we stared down the barrel of that particular gun actually and just didn't want to go there again. So some good questions that you might actually just want to ask yourselves anyway, and whether you know the answers to them. So our timeline, so we won the competition September 19, and October 2019 is when the questionnaires were completed, and that was by the trustees and the senior management team. I would say it was pulling teeth a little bit, getting a few other trustees to complete it. So what I would say is anybody considering going on a journey like this is people need to be on board, because otherwise what you're going to get isn't a true full set of results. So you really need to have everybody on board and understanding why everybody needs a voice, and they can't just think, oh well, everybody else will do it, I don't need to bother. But throughout that, I was getting regular updates from Helen, so I could nudge people regularly to get the surveys done. So the report came in September 2019, so very quickly after the surveys had been done. And Helen then met with myself, the chair, and another trustee who led on governance at the time to really talk through that report in a huge amount of detail so that we understood what it was telling us. And from that, we could identify some really quick wins that we could just tick off really quickly that actually weren't going to take a huge amount of effort, but would move governance on quite quickly. So we really liked that. There was some elements of the report that we kind of didn't understand what the answers were telling us. So, for example, we'd gone back to Helen and said, we don't understand what it's telling us about fundraising. Can you dig a bit deeper? And Helen was able to do that and come back with some quite specific information that had been in the report just to help our understanding. Helen came along in March 2020, and it seems really weird me saying that date because the world all went belly up afterwards, but hell, we got our governance review workshop in before it did. So a session with myself, Helen, all of the trustees and our senior team, just really digging deep into this report and understanding what it meant to us and what we then wanted an action plan to look like. So we developed an action plan resulting from that. And in March 2021, we commissioned a second DigiBoard review because we'd liked the first one so much. We understood, you know, the first one we did, let's be honest, because it came free, but actually what we got from that and the wealth of information and how it helped us to transform our governance meant that the trustees and I then decided that we'd do another one in March 21. So what that was able to do for us is to show, and you get this wheel as part of the reporting. So on the left was the first one and on the right is the second one. And what I really like about this wheel is it just kind of gives you a very quick look at, right, that's deep green, brilliant, we can celebrate that, but actually why is that amber? So, you know, we were feeling a bit smug when we did the one next year, because there was only one little bit of amber on there actually. So, you know, what it showed was that by doing the review, understanding our governance in a really deep way, we were able to put meaningful action plans into place so that actually we could really see those improvements. I also really like things like this in the report, that it tells you what your top strengths are, and that's broken down by what your trustees think they are and what your SMT think that they are. And what's interesting for me in this most recent one is that the top three strengths, you can see that the trustees and the SMT are pretty well aligned actually, but where we need to improve, there's less alignment, which is probably why it needs to improve actually, because there's less alignment between those things. But no surprise, I guess, you know, it shows that in 2019 we needed to improve diversity in decision making, and it's still there. But there, you know, there's some comfort in continuity, I guess. So it shows that that's still a thread that actually we do want to make some improvements on. But again, it's just helped us drill that action plan down into even more detail. I also love kind of an idiot's guide how to do better. So what the report will come through and tell you is, here's some things that you can just do better. So here's some things that we recommend that you can do. So all of that doesn't have to come from you just being told what's wrong and what you need to improve. The DigiBoard thing itself will tell you, here's some stuff that you can just do that will make things better. So why did we use DigiBoard? Well, yes, it came free first time, but they are very easy to work with. Helen is very responsive, helpful and supportive. The reports are, and the questionnaires and everything about it really is relatable, and it's linked to the charity governance code, so you can take some reassurance that what you're being reported on comes from something that means something. I like that it involved all of SMT and the trustees, and that the report separated those two things out. That really helped our depth of understanding. The huge detail that's in the report, you could really lose yourself in some of the details. So any of the detail geeks amongst you are going to love it. But also if you actually just want that high level stuff, that's there too, but you can drill into the details. So it's a really nice mix of both of those. Anything that gives me an idiot's guide to how to make things better will always tick my boxes, and the reports, as I've shown you, do that. I like that if you then go back, it can show you either progress or decline. and I like that it's benchmarked in the sector, and we felt really smug this time when we did it, because we were above benchmark, or three of the markers were at benchmark, everything else was above. So I like my smugness that I got from the report this year. But it kind of does mean something actually that it's benchmarked in the sector, so that you can really understand how you're doing compared to others. So that's why we work with Digiboard again. And I guess this last slide just shows it's very much a journey, and it's not done yet. And already in the strategy is that there will be a future Digiboard review, because it's just something that trustees, they just really rate it and understand it and feel that it's just improved our governance, but also their level of assurance about their governance. It's not just that we think that we're doing it well, we've actually got some real evidence there now that we're doing it well. So big fan, can you tell? I'll pause there.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So Terry, David and Helen, thank you very much. I'm going to kick off with some questions, but please put your questions in the box, either in the Q&A box or in the chat box. Really keen to